Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Emily Mann, and I'm a teaching professor in the Human Services program in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, and a research associate with the Dukakis Center and the Northeastern Public Evaluation Lab here at Northeastern University in Boston. First, a few quick logistics. This meeting is being recorded, and we will be using the Q&A function at the end of the session. Please feel free to add your questions, and we'll do our best to take as many questions as we can. I'd like to thank Jean Patrizio, Ryan Gosser, and Natalia Stone for their assistance in preparing for our webinar today, and Jenny Stevens and Lori Gardenier for their support of today's event, which is hosted by the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, the Human Services Program, and the Northeastern School of Law. This panel developed after a film screening in my spring 2020 social policy class called Targeting El Paso. This frontline film, which can be streamed at PBS, highlighted the tragic shooting in 2019 at Walmart in El Paso. And the documentary discussed the surrounding context of immigration policy and its impacts on the community. In the class at the time was a student of mine, Oriana Dominguez, a human services student from El Paso, Texas. After class, we talked about her city and the impacts of immigration, and it was her idea to convene this panel, and I'm so grateful that along with her mother, a local El Paso attorney, Lynn Coyle, we have gathered this incredible group of policymakers, advocates, lawyers, and journalists to talk about immigration policy today. I'm very grateful to get right to it, and so I would like to introduce our moderator, Professor Rachel Rosenbloom, who teaches and writes in the area of immigration law and policy. She is Associate Dean for Experiential Education here at Northeastern University School of Law. Her recent scholarship is focused on the intersection of criminal law and immigration law, the possibilities and limits of transnational legal advocacy in advancing the rights of deportees, and the role of race and immigration in the historical development of U.S. citizenship law. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad we have such a big turnout today. And I want to thank our panelists for taking time out of your extremely busy schedules to share your insights with us. And I really want to thank Professor Mann for pulling this all together. I was really excited when she contacted me a couple months ago with this idea, and it's so nice to see it come to fruition. So I teach immigration law and refugee and asylum law, and I was co-teaching with Professor Gundavaram the Immigrant Justice Clinic the last few years. And all of us who are involved in this area, whether we're lawyers or professors or politicians or journalists or anyone, it's been a really long 4 years. We have been on a constant state of alert, and we have gone to bed every night not knowing what crisis was going to face us in the morning, what new executive order or proposed regulation or new enforcement policy. So, I mean, really, it's virtually every aspect of immigration law that's been transformed over the last 4 years. But in no area has it been more transformed than in the asylum system at the border. So that's our subject today. And it's, there's been a lot of changes, but at the same time, there were some problems that are much more deeply entrenched, right? That predated the Trump administration, that will likely persist even if the Biden administration proceeds with unwinding some of those changes, as it has already started to do. So we're here to kind of take stock of where we are. What happened during the Trump administration? What changes do we already see now from the Biden administration? What changes do we think we will see, or do we hope that we will see? And then, what are the issues the deeper issues that we also want to make sure don't fall off our radar as we, even as we focus on the kind of the crisis that is at hand. So that's a tall order. Well, I'll have to speak quickly. But we have an incredible group of people here with us today. And so what I'd like you to do, folks on the panel, is speak for about 6 or 7 minutes each. And I will hold up a little sign when your time limit is getting near, and then I will give you a chance to respond a little bit to each other when that's over, and then I will moderate a question. So folks in the audience, feel free to post questions in the chat at any time. All right, so I will introduce each of our panelists as in the order that they're speaking. So our first panelist today is Robert Moore. He is a journalist. He's been a journalist in the Texas borderlands since 1986. His work has received a number of top journalism honors, including the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award. He's a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and he was awarded the Benjamin C. Bradley Editor of the Year Award. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, National Public Radio, The Guardian, many, many other outlets. And he is the founder and CEO of El Paso Matters, which covers the border specifically. So what I'd love to know from you, Mr. Moore, is how have we gotten to the moment we're in right now at the border? Can you kind of give us a brief overview of the changes that took place during the Trump administration? And then, since you're a journalist who's covered this subject for a long time, I'd love if you could give us your thoughts in particular on one question of terminology that's been bubbling up a lot recently, which is, are we seeing a crisis? There's a question of what do we call this right now, right? Should we be calling this a crisis at the border? Is there another word that would be better? So please give us the lay of the land.
Thank you so much for having me, and a special thanks to Oriana for having the idea for this. I've known Oriana since she was a toddler, and she's an amazing future leader for El Paso, and we're really excited that she was passionate enough about what was happening in her community to try to bring this issue to a broader audience. So thank you very much, Oriana, and thank you, Lynn, who in full disclosure is my attorney too. So she helps me do battle against the government all the time. So I appreciate that. And it's also very much an honor to be on this panel with Veronica Escobar and Taylor Levy, who, in my view, are two of the most important leaders in the world on this issue. Both of them, from different perspectives, have literally put their own bodies on the line to address these issues. And Taylor knows that she's one of my heroes. Really admire the work that she's done. So it's a real pleasure to be here. You know, I think that Veronica wrote an op-ed in the New York Times recently that I think is very important for anybody to read, because we're already framing this conversation in the context of the border. And that's where, as a political discussion, we often get lost. The border is one piece of this broader humanitarian issue, and our border is just one of many borders where we're seeing these issues. We're seeing this massive displacement of humanity all across the world because of violence and insecurity and poverty and climate change, and all of these issues sort of roll together. So what we're going to talk about today is one piece of a very big global challenge, especially for developed countries, which by and large have responded to these multiple crises, and I freely use that word. They've responded to these multiple crises in ways very similar to what the United States has done, and that's to throw up walls, both literal and figurative, to try to stop this flow of humanity, which is the greatest displacement we've seen globally since World War II. In our part of the world, on the U.S.-Mexico border, I think the first important part of context to understand is that until the last decade or so, we had been in a 20-year decline in attempts to cross our border, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But until the last decade or so, migration across the U.S.-Mexico border mainly came from people from Mexico, primarily single men who were coming across to seek work and wanted to go back to their home villages. And so we hardened our border in ways that sort of backfired on us in many ways, because it wound up trapping migrants who wanted to be here only temporarily. It turned them into permanent residents because they couldn't move back and forth and it forced many of them to start to bring their families with them too, instead of just coming across as single adults. And this wound up presenting challenges to local governments. Congresswoman Escobar was our county judge before she was in Congress, and this created issues for our school systems, for our public hospitals and things like that. So all of these policies have these consequences that we don't always think of. I would say the other consequence of the hardening of the border that we began to see in Bill Clinton's administration was a very deliberate decision to force migrants away from urban areas like El Paso and into more remote areas of southern New Mexico, Arizona, and the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. One of the results of this is that thousands of people have died trying to cross the US-Mexico border in the last 20 years, either through heat exposure or drowning, or they fall victim to criminal organizations. So all of this has been going on sort of under the radar, where I think the US public really doesn't want to confront the realities of some of the political decisions we've made. And we can have great conversations about what role borders should play and what roles they shouldn't play. But I think if we're going to harden our borders, we have to have an honest conversation about the consequences of that and what that means. So at the same time, the United States was hardening its borders and tightening immigration laws beginning in the mid-1990s, Mexico was going through a transformation that was the main driver of the decline in migration across the border. The Mexican economy improved. The fertility rate among Mexican women dropped from an average of 6 children per woman in 1960 to fewer than 2 in the 1990s. So particularly as the condition of lives of women began to improve in Mexico, a lot of these migratory pressures began to decline. And I think one of the things to remember is that in 2016, the typical Border Patrol agent in El Paso apprehended 2 undocumented immigrants per month. And we had this huge increase in manpower on the border and also physical barriers at a time when they honestly really weren't needed. And at the same time, the Border Patrol sort of deliberately recast itself as a terrorism fighting organization. And they tried to portray the US-Mexico border as this potential entry point for terrorists from around the world. And of course, our experience with 9/11, none of those people came through the southern border. They all came into the United States on legitimate visas and overstayed their visas. We've never had a terror attack in the United States that's been tied to anybody crossing the US-Mexico border. We have had terror attacks linked to people who cross the Canadian border. We're not building walls at the Canadian border. And I would suggest the reason for that is that Canadians are white and Mexicans aren't. I mean, it's just as blunt as that. So since 2014, we've seen an increase in migration from Central America, particularly from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. That's driven by all of the problems that I talked about earlier, violence, insecurity, poverty, climate change. Those issues have tended to come in surges. It's kind of gone up and down. We had our first big surge in 2014, then again in 2018 and 2019, and we're seeing the beginnings of one now. In part, one of the reasons we're seeing the challenges we are now is because the pandemic sort of bottled up demand for more than a year, and now that pent-up demand is being released. And on the important issue of whether this is a crisis, yes, it's not just one crisis. It's a multitude of crises. Every person who comes to the border represents a crisis because they made a very difficult decision to leave their home and family because they were fleeing something where the best option looked to be to make a dangerous trek across Mexico to come to the border. So it's an individual crisis. It's a crisis in Central America. It's a crisis in Mexico, and particularly in Mexico right now because of US policies that's basically outsourced our challenges to Mexico. And it's a challenge and continues to be a political challenge in the United States, which just refuses, primarily driven by Republicans, just refuses to come to grips with the immigration issues, even on issues like DACA, where there's, near unanimous agreement that we ought to be protecting certain migrants or certain immigrants, we can't even come to an agreement on that. So I hope that's a great overview, and I think Veronica Taylor will give you a lot more depth to that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was a great overview. We're going to turn now to Congresswoman Veronica Escobar. She is a third-generation resident of El Paso, and she represents the 16th Congressional District in Texas. She is the first woman elected to this seat and the first of 2 Latinas from Texas to serve in Congress. Prior to entering politics, as you've already heard, she was a judge in El Paso. She's also been a professor and a nonprofit executive. She was elected in 2019 and has already established herself as a voice of for the border and for the borderlands and the folks who live there, and as a national leader on gun safety, healthcare, and immigration. And boy, do we need leadership on all those issues right now. So thank you for that. Representative Escobar, please give us your perspective as a legislator. What's changed under the Biden administration? What additional changes would you like to see? And is there a role for Congress to play in addressing the current issues at the border?
Thank you for that question. And I too want to echo my gratitude to Northwestern, but also to Northeastern, and also to Oriana Dominguez and her mom, Lynn Coyle. And it is so incredible that Oriana is taking her love and concern for our community and her compassion for migrants all the way to college, and making sure that we have these important discussions and that we come together to think about the future and think about what we're doing. And I also want to say Taylor is one of my heroes. Bob is one of the great truth tellers, and our community has relied on his truth telling for a long time, and we've relied on Taylor's advocacy for a long time and her hard work. There is a very important role for Congress to play, and unfortunately, what we've seen happen over and over again is not just Congress punting and avoiding any real conversations about how to address the situation at hand and how to think beyond our borders, because as Bob mentioned, this is identifying this as a border issue is so incredibly short-sighted, and it really is just a vehicle for politicizing the immigration challenges that we face, the migration issues that we will continue to see exacerbated by climate change and by violence and by poverty and instability in our hemisphere. And Congress continues to really avoid solving anything meaningful. What we had, or offering any meaningful solutions. What we had last week as a perfect example was 18 members of the Senate, and they were our Republican colleagues in the Senate, who basically parachuted into the border. And I'm sure you saw Ted Cruz and his performance, in the dark, in camouflage fatigue-like outfits, whispering into his camera about the dangers and the risks of the border there at the banks of the Rio Grande, being heckled by what I guess he identified as human traffickers or drug traffickers. And then you see them on the boat, the Border Patrol boat that is full on warfare style equipment. When we know what we're seeing mostly at our nation's front doors, children and vulnerable families. And their performance was not about finding solutions. It was not about talking about the challenges we face in any serious way. In many ways, they like having this situation. They like the fact that we've not addressed this in a meaningful way. They enjoy the fact that they get to use this as red meat for their constituents and get to perform in front of the nation. Someone like Lindsey Graham, how long has Lindsey Graham been in the US Senate? How long has he had an opportunity to lead on this issue? My own senators who were the hosts of this exercise in political theater, John Cornyn and Ted Cruz, they were in control during the 2 years that their party had the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives recently. And during their time in power, we had a government shutdown. That's what they did. This is the context that folks like me face as we're trying to talk about solutions and trying to address long-term chronic challenges that we face that have only gotten more serious. Bob laid out very effectively what's happened, the trajectory that we've been on as a country, the types of migrants that we've seen over time. In 2019, at the height of the Trump administration's whatever you want to call it, a crisis or a challenge. I don't think it's a crisis for our country. I think Bob's right. It's a crisis for the individuals. But for one of the wealthiest countries in the world, for us to call our inconvenience a crisis, I have found offensive over and over again. But at the height of what was happening in 2019, as we saw more and more and more families arriving at our front door, only to be met with cruelty, I brought members of Congress, I brought my colleagues to El Paso literally every other weekend. I had what was called a CODEL, a Congressional Delegation visit. Taylor's nodding because many times she was one of our subject matter experts to help brief the members of Congress, because what I was trying to do was bring humanity to the issue and have my colleagues confront the situation without the fog of media interpretation, without a partisan fog, with just with a very clear-eyed view of what was happening in the community. And I invited Republicans and Democrats alike, and frequently it was only in fact, always it was only my Democratic colleagues who accepted. This past weekend, I restarted our congressional delegation visits, and I had a Republican colleague join me, Victoria Spartz from Indiana. And during the visit, I laid out for her especially just what I think we've been doing wrong, in the hopes that she had an open heart and an open mind. I also met with Tony Gonzalez on Monday and met, asked him to meet with Ruben Garcia, one of our great NGO leaders, runs Annunciation House, a hospitality center, asked him to have an open mind and an open heart. It's going to be a long journey to get members of Congress to see past the politics and look at this with an open mind and open heart. But, one of the things that we frequently come up against, and both of my colleagues mentioned this, is the idea that we have to continue to secure the border. And again, it's that incredibly frustrating reckoning with the fact that because everything outside of it is so challenging and it's so hard and it's not a quick and easy fix, it's much easier to say, we'll just fix the border. And it is the laziest approach possible. It's the most destructive approach possible. And as I told both of them, and as I have told innumerable colleagues, that approach actually makes us less secure as a country, because it treats children and women and men and families who are running for their lives as though they are a national security threat. And they are not. And I just want to tell a super quick story because I know I'm out of time. But one of the first international trips I took as a member of Congress was to the Middle East. And I went to Jordan and Baghdad, went to Jordan and Iraq. And when we were in Jordan, I wanted to see and asked to see the Jordanian-Syrian border, because I wanted to see what one of the most dangerous borders in the world actually looks like. A border where there truly was a crisis, where we had more than 1 million, they had more than 1 million refugees spilling over into and seeking shelter in Jordan. Not a wall in sight. And I asked specifically if there were any walls. There were no walls. Their security was done through technology funded by the American taxpayer. And when we went to their immigrant processing centers, now mind you, as a quick reminder, in our processing centers, we saw an incredible lack of humanity where people were being held for months, sometimes for several weeks, if not months. I asked the woman who was running that processing center how long it took them to process their refugees. And whereas ours took weeks, sometimes months, she was almost wringing her hands in embarrassment saying, it's several hours and we're trying to cut that down. So a country with far fewer resources and far greater challenges can do a much better job. Surely the United States of America can as well.
Thank you so much. Yes. And, thank you for putting it in that perspective, right? I often show my students sort of the number of refugees who are in countries like Jordan. And it dwarfs the event that we are dealing with here. So I am now going to turn things over to Attorney Taylor Levy, who, as several people have already said, she's a hero. She's a hero to me too, I should say. She's very well known among attorneys working on these issues. She is an attorney who has worked in El Paso, and after a decade of working with various nonprofits, she founded her own legal consulting firm dedicated to protecting the rights of asylum seekers arriving at the southern border. She currently provides pro bono assistance to asylum-seeking families who have been returned to Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, under the Remain in Mexico program. And she also provides education and advocacy around issues affecting asylum seekers at the border. And I'll just say firsthand, I have experienced her incredible amount of knowledge and her incredible generosity with that knowledge. We had a case, I was supervising students in our immigrant justice clinic last year on a case involving someone who was in the Remain in Mexico program, who had there were some novel legal issues presented by his case, and we were trying to sort through them. And I reached out to people who had, more experience at the border, and I finally found my way to Taylor. And then all the doors opened up. Like, she knew everyone who had the cases. It was just this wealth of knowledge. So, Taylor, what I'd love to hear from you is tell us about your work on the front lines, providing assistance to individuals and families who are seeking asylum. And I'm really would love to know from your perspective, what has changed since January 20th and what additional changes would you like to see?
Yeah, I mean, thank you all so much for having me. I'll echo what everyone else said about it's such an honor to be on this panel with the Congresswoman, with Bob. We've worked together very closely over the past 11 years, I guess now, and that's it's been a really hard time. Everything, El Paso has been such a lab or a staging ground for terrible Trump policy after terrible Trump policy. And it's the type of thing where there were so many times that myself and my colleagues, not to mention the migrants themselves, would say, okay, things can't get worse than this. At first, with family detention, and then with family separation, the summer of 2018, I remember all of us feeling like it can't get worse, it can't get worse. And then Remain in Mexico happened, which is the migrant protection protocols, which is when Ted Cruz has been doing a lot of speaking about how great Remain in Mexico is right now and how it's wonderful and it worked. And I'm just like, our heads are exploding that Remain in Mexico, which was the policy by which people would cross and then be told to wait in Mexico for their court hearing, was actually a ridiculous fail in so many ways, including for border security, because huge percentages of the people in Remain in Mexico, I would estimate probably about 50%, actually ended up re-entering the United States undetected. So secretly sneaking in, if you want to call it that, and are now in the United States after they were people who were trying to do everything the right way. They were trying to seek asylum. They were trying to go to their court cases. But after being stuck in Mexico for 2 years, where they were constantly subject to kidnappings, to rapes, to extortion, to being robbed by the police officers, to being beaten in the streets, they had to make this decision to stop trying to do things the right and legal way through the asylum system, because seeking asylum, going to another country and asking for protection is legal. This is not illegal immigration. This is legal immigration. This is people coming and asking for help. And the Remain in Mexico program was a program by which people would come and ask for help on our southern borders. We would process them, usually in these horrible conditions for several days, processing, doing their paperwork, and then dump them on the streets of Mexico and say, come back for a court date in 4 months. But your case won't be done at your first court date or your second court date. It'd probably usually take about 3 to 4 court dates, and each one's 3 to 4 months apart. And then the pandemic happened. So all of the courts stopped from March 20th, 2020 until now, all of the courts stopped. So this means a bunch of people who wanted to do things the right way were waiting and waiting, were put into these impossible situations where it was literally, well, do I keep waiting for my court case, or do I try and get into the United States a different way, because otherwise I'm going to lose my life? And so it didn't actually help border security whatsoever. It was actually a program that I saw very firsthand increased border insecurity and really raised the rates and the fees that are being used by coyotes or polleros, smugglers, human smugglers, which are different than traffickers. A smuggler is someone who helps someone get across, who wants to get across, as opposed to a trafficker is someone who kidnaps someone and crosses them by force. Where rates for smugglers went up astronomically, because if somebody is coming and they want to seek asylum, yes, they go to the border, they go to the Rio Grande, they pay, lots of times they don't pay, they just walk across and say, hi, here I am. They're not climbing over any fences, they're not crossing in the middle of the night, they're coming and requesting asylum, they're asking border officers for asylum. And you're paying basically nothing, to a system where with remain in Mexico, and then after that with the pandemic era closures, which they call Title 42, which was just like no more asylum at all, everyone's getting deported, that was Trump, everyone's gone. We have a situation where instead of families going and asking, for asylum and asking for protection, and I want my day in court and I want to follow the process, we instead have people telling me that they're paying $10,000, $12,000, for themselves and their children a piece, trying to enter in a manner that is undetected, so they won't get caught. And, I've been doing this work for 11 years, and I had almost never heard about children trying to climb the wall, because the people climbing the wall are usually young, fit, able-bodied men for the most part. And now all of a sudden in the past year, I'm seeing, small children climbing over the wall, falling off the wall, and then being immediately deported back to Mexico, even though they're Central Americans, being sent back to Mexico under this new Title 42 thing, or last year, Title 42 thing, where they're little kids, 10-year-old kids who are covered in blood, and they're being removed back to the streets of Juarez. And I was meeting them on the streets of Juarez, from March onwards, because they tried to climb over the wall when they never would have done that before. They are people who would have just been seeking asylum, but the market shifted since it became impossible to seek asylum, impossible to just turn yourselves in, where the coyotes, the smugglers, innovated. They wanted the money, they innovated to create more and more dangerous ways for people to cross. And we have seen an explosion of border deaths in the past year compared to every other fiscal year. I think it's getting to the point where I'm hearing reports every couple of weeks. In the last week, we had someone drown. This week, we had a 9-year-old child drown last week. The week before, we had a Cuban man fall off the wall and die. And then a couple weeks or several weeks ago, we had another Cuban man who was shot and killed by Border Patrol as he was crossing. And all of these stories are barely even making the news. Like this 9-year-old girl who just drowned, she drowned in front of her mother and her 3-year-old little brother. And just the extreme amount of desperation you must be in to be making this type of a choice shows that these are people who are making it is a personal crisis for them. I agree with Bob on that personal crisis, but it's not a crisis for us as a nation. Exactly as the Congresswoman said, we have completely the logistical capacity to deal with this type of a logistical challenge. We know how to deal with this. It's not rocket science, and it's not new. It is even the increased numbers right now are not something that's new and shocking. You can look at it, you can look at the charts, there's always seasonal migration flows. We do have a bit of a bottleneck because of COVID and because of the fact that there has been, no way to seek asylum for so many years. and because countries, it's harder to leave and et cetera, et cetera. But what we have is we have a logistical challenge that we are able to meet. We are supposedly the greatest nation in the world. We are Americans, we are scrappy. We know how to address these challenges. We have the technology, we have the NGO partners and attorneys and donors who are all willing to work on these things. What we need is we need the political will. And I think we do need more changes than we've seen, unfortunately. I feel bad for the Biden administration in terms of that they inherited such a massive mess. And Stephen Miller and President Trump did everything possible to create as much drama and human suffering on the border as they could. But Ted Cruz yesterday saying that Remain in Mexico is a success, I'm like, it was a human suffering and tragedy and literal torture. But even if I take it back from that perspective, like my dad's a big old Republican Trumper, and I've told him stories for the last year about how MPP and Title 42 are bad for border security. They are not a good solution for border security whatsoever. And that's, I think, the biggest lesson that we need to take away as we're moving forward. And the administration does need to act faster, but I also recognize that it's tough. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we're here at Northeastern University. We're virtual, we're on Zoom, but we are this is at Northeastern in whatever sense that is right now. And so I want to bring this back to what's happening in Boston here in the Northeastern campus in terms of connecting with the border work. So I want to, our next speaker is Professor Hemanth Gundavaram, who has been a professor. He's a clinical professor of law. He's been at the law school since 2014. He is the co-founder and the director of the school's Immigrant Justice Clinic. I've co-taught the clinic with him, so I can say firsthand what an amazing professor he is. But I'm not the only one to recognize this. In 2019, he was voted the law school's Professor of the Year and the commencement speaker. Professor Gundavaram, tell us what the Northeastern connection is. How have Northeastern faculty and students been involved in advocacy at the border? And are there ways for students to connect to this work?
Sure. Thank you. It's an honor to be on this panel and to talk about these important issues. I wanted to first talk a little bit about what a law school clinic is, because I know there's a lot of law students on here, but there's also people from around the university and the community who might not know what a law school clinic is. So we opened the Immigrant Justice Clinic here at Northeastern in 2017. And I say we, Professor Rosenbloom said, I'm the co-founder. The other founder was herself. The two of us opened the clinic in 2017. I now run the clinic, I say alone, but I don't really run the clinic alone, because the way the clinic runs is that every term law students and law student attorneys are doing the legal work for our clients. Our clinic is a pro bono clinic, meaning that we don't charge for our services. And thanks to fundraising and grants, we are also generally able to cover all application fees and costs for any of our clients. Law students take the clinic as a course. It's really a double course. They get double credit for it because of the amount of time that's involved. We say somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 hours per week working on cases in the clinic. And essentially the students manage the day-to-day aspects of the legal work of all of our cases. That means they call clients, they meet with them these days by Zoom, they interview the clients, they draft memos, they fill out applications, they write affidavits and legal briefs, they research country conditions, they contact experts, and if we're at a hearing or government interview, and this is always the part that surprises people, they make the argument in front of the judge or the asylum officer. It's really an invaluable experience for the students. Simply put, they're practicing law, but under the safety and supervision and guidance of a clinical professor. Obviously, the situation at the border has been, we sometimes say a man-made situation and tragedy and crisis, and made by the United States government, particularly under the previous administration, but in prior administrations throughout our history, and even continuing to today, even though things have gotten better. Certainly, I think there are changes that we all on this panel probably wish we could make. But of course, we've always felt somewhat limited being in Boston. Until about a year ago, our clinic really accepted only cases locally, taking essentially in a situation where a client could take the subway to our campus and meet with our students. These were immigrants who might have crossed the border, but who ended up in Boston. To make it easier to interview in person regularly, we often didn't even accept cases from Central or Western Massachusetts. But about a year ago, all of that changed. Student interest was very high in helping at the border, and that really was where we saw the greatest need. We were hearing some of the numbers, and other people on the panel could talk to this. The number of cases that each attorney has at the border is astronomical. It's a number that's not sustainable, and so we wanted to assist. So we went from taking cases within a few miles of campus to taking almost exclusively cases at the southern border for the last year. Our first step was finding organizations doing the work there who needed help. We connected with 2 organizations, Al Otro Lado in California, at the California-Mexico border, and Lawyers for Good Government at the Texas-Mexico border. We knew that these organizations were experts in the area, and we offered our help wherever it would be most beneficial for them. So for the last year, we've essentially served as allies, as attorneys, as interns, helping these organizations with whatever they needed. Just to give you a little sense of what the students have been working on, we have been assisting with half-day intakes of asylum seekers for these organizations to determine the strength of the cases for the asylum seekers. Our law students signed up for half-day shifts to ensure coverage throughout the week. We also use Northeastern student interpreters to assist our law students with the intakes when there was a language barrier. We also completed asylum applications and are currently reviewing and editing asylum applications for individuals who are likely going to be pro se. We want to complete the applications for them so they can use the documents that are filed. So we have been reviewing applications and filling out applications, including writing affidavits to tell the client's story, finding supporting documents, drafting the legal brief, bringing together all of the law and facts in the case to make compelling arguments that the client should receive asylum. All of the clients that we previously worked for, thankfully under the new administration's policies, who were in the Remain in Mexico program are now in the United States and can fight their asylum cases with those documents. We've also even been doing with client confidentiality. I've been teaching a course with undergraduate students where they've been researching and drafting country conditions for these organizations and for some of our cases locally. Many of them now want to do immigration work. So it's like 18, 19-year-olds who are now very interested in this topic. And the last way we've been trying to assist is to run service trips to the border to assist for a week. The students put in pretty long days, 14, 16-hour days, assisting at the border with organizations there as well. I know there are a number of students on the call today who have done those service trips, and we plan to do more of those once it's safe to travel. You know, when I think about what this has taught our students, you know, it's ultimately in a very large problem that, again, is created by the US government. It's a small impact, and the odds are stacked against many of the asylum seekers at the border, but it is the kind of service that we teach our students is important to spend a lifetime being involved in. Many of our clinic students go on to practice immigration law, and I know many are interested in providing their service where it is most necessary at the border. And to those who don't, you know, they receive the skills to assist in other areas of public interest, from housing to domestic violence to poverty to criminal justice. And many other students, I think, after doing this work, frankly, see how big of a problem is, and that direct client representation can only go so far. As representing one individual can only do so much, that they have become very involved and interested in doing larger policy work to actually break down some of the systems that have created these problems. So the thing I say to everyone all the time about the clinic and our work, it's really an honor to teach the law students who are desperate to help those in need, and especially to see so many young people, from college students to law students, who care about this issue and want to make a difference, I think is inspiring. And most of all, it's always an honor to represent the immigrants who demonstrate so much bravery and courage to leave their homes in search of safety. And to me, that is sort of the narrative that has to be given. It's not about danger or terrorism. It's really about people who have immense amounts of strength and courage and bravery, who we would be very, very lucky to have in our country. So again, thank you for having me on the panel, and looking forward to hearing some of the questions.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for your remarks. And I just want to say, in terms of organizations that we've collaborated with, I want to give a shout out to one more, because I got the case I mentioned earlier, we came through the El Paso Immigration Collaborative, EPIC. So I know I've got a bunch of El Paso people here, so I just wanted to give a shout out to them. So
Epic let me use their office for free for like a year and a half.
Yeah,
so
they do great work
closely with Epic.
Yeah, and there's all these organizations doing amazing work on the border, and there's also, I think, one of the things we've seen over the last few years is this incredible development of this infrastructure to allow people who are not at the border, attorneys and law students, to work on these cases, there's all these sort of electronic systems that have been set up, and you can do telephonic hearings, and it's amazing to me how much you can do from a distance on these cases, and bring some really much needed resources to the border. So we do have one question in the Q&A, and I just want to encourage anyone else out there in the audience to post questions in the Q&A if you'd like. Before we get to that, do any of you want to respond or add anything to what's been said, or should we go right to the questions?
I'd say let's go to the questions.
Okay. All right, well, the first one's a big one. So, and this is for anybody here. What do you think is the biggest, most important policy proposal to solve the immigration issues at the southern border? If you had to pick one thing right now on your wish list, what would you do?
Can I attack that just as a member of Congress? This is the challenge with thinking about this, as though there's one thing. This is part of my challenge in trying to educate my colleagues and also educate the public. And it's part of why I wrote the op-ed piece that Bob mentioned, because this is going to be a multifaceted, long-term challenge. There is nothing that is going to fix this from one day to the next. And in fact, I've been trying to manage people's expectations, especially my colleagues, telling them it is going to continue to get more challenging and more inconvenient for some, because this has been such a long neglected issue. And it's been a failure, not just on the domestic policy front, but on the foreign policy front. So we've ignored, as a country, everything happening around us. And we thought we can just live our little isolated lives and not think that what we've done has impacted Central America and Mexico, whether that's our own personal roles in the face of a climate catastrophe, our lack of leadership as a federal government on the climate catastrophe, our involvement in meddling in Central American countries that have made things worse. We are now today living the consequences of decades of what we've done and haven't done to make this worse. So the multifaceted approach, from my view, and it kind of goes again to the original question you asked me, what can Congress do? We have to, number one, do everything possible to create a more dignified process for people arriving here. We've got to educate the country that many of these families are coming to reunite with family members already here, many of them essential workers during the COVID pandemic. We've got to rethink the way the Department of Homeland Security operates. We've got to work as a hemisphere with our neighbors to address all of this, to address criminal organizations, poverty, et cetera, you name it. We all live in the same neighborhood. And until we work that way, we can't build walls high enough, thick enough, deep enough. And so this is really a day of reckoning, I think, and we need to see it as such, to the fact that it's not a light switch. It's not one solution. It's not a one size fits all. It's going to be tough.
Thank you. Anyone want to add something to that, or should we go on to the next question?
The one thing I would add,
Go
just building off of what Veronica said, we run a risk of focusing this too much on the US response. One of the things that I think has to happen, especially with the developed world, is a reexamination of asylum and what necessitates asylum. We're still operating on a system that was designed specifically to address post-World War II issues on what was a valid asylum claim and what was not. And so we have no way of addressing climate change disruptions for now, for example. Now, and I don't want to use that as an excuse for the United States not to do anything over the next 20 years until the rest of the world comes around. But the truth is, until the developed world takes a new approach to asylum and to refugees, we're going to be stuck in this constant hamster wheel.
Yeah, Taylor?
Either way, yeah, I agree with everything the Congresswoman said and Bob said. My one difference right now, there's no one solution, but one solution that would help right now is the bridges have been closed. The ports of entry, the bridges have been closed for an entire year because of COVID. So it is literally impossible for me, 99.9% impossible for me to help anyone as an attorney. All I've done for the last year basically is explain to other attorneys and migrants that I can't help them. There's nothing they can do. They are screwed. So when as the lawyer, am saying all of that, where are desperate people going to turn? To the smugglers. And that is still the situation. I can basically help no one legally. And I'm an attorney and that's my job, and I'm a good attorney and I'm good at my job, and people call me every day and think I'm going to be able to tell them, oh, do this, because I'm a really good attorney. Nope. I tell them, sorry, there's no option. And they're like, well, should I just go to Coyote then? Because my cousin got in. And I don't know what to say to that. And I saw the question in the chat. I just want to point it out. Someone asked about Venezuelans. I just want to point out these are not all Central Americans. I work with loads of Venezuelans, loads of Cubans. And it's interesting because Venezuelans and Cubans in the United States, the Cuban Americans and Venezuelan Americans tend to be very, very strongly Republican, such as Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio. And the Trump administration treated those populations absolutely horrifically. They are the most likely to be kidnapped in Mexico and in Juarez because it's known that their family members in the US tend to have more money than Central Americans because they tend to be wealthier, they tend to be Republicans. So they are most frequently targeted for kidnapping. And the number of Cubans who I've worked with who have been kidnapped and raped is just astronomical. Same thing with the Venezuelans. And just to not forget that we are talking about Nicaraguans, Cubans, Venezuelans, Haitians, all kinds of people, not just Central Americans. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'll just add a quick one.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I'm just going to add just a quick
one.
Yeah. Just as it'll be quick. It's just mine is dependent on what Taylor said, but is a guaranteed right to counsel for all immigrants, which if you imagine the injustice in the criminal justice system and then take away the attorneys, that's what immigration is.
Yeah. Thanks. So we have so many questions and we have 4 minutes left. I don't think we'll get to them all, unfortunately, but let me put one out there, just maybe a quick answer from how can non-law students get involved? Either from the perspective of nonprofit organizations or within Northeastern. Does anyone have any thoughts on where to send folks?
I think number one, elections matter. So get involved politically.
Yeah.
There are lots of volunteer opportunities at the border if you want to come, but there are also volunteer opportunities, I think, in your home communities. Immigration is not a border issue. It's a nationwide issue. There are immigrants facing extreme hardships all across the country. There are lots of good organizations right in your hometown if you want to reach out to help them. And if you want to come to the border and help, there are lots of organizations that we could connect you with too.
All right, so I think the last question we'll have time for, just a quick answer from anyone. The big question here: how do we build the political will to make these changes that we need to see in and build the political power?
I will say I need help from folks across the country to pressure their members of Congress and their senators to restore humanity and dignity to the system. part of what is creating this gridlock for, as Bob mentioned, even the DREAM Act, is because politicians believe that immigration, if they're a Democrat, it's a losing issue. If they're a Republican, it's a winning issue if it can be as awful as possible. And they're responding to voters and constituents. So I think political pressure is really important. And the political pressure that works is when you call and you're from their district. Calling across from outside, it doesn't make the same difference as you calling your reps and your senators.
Right. Well, on that note, I think it's unfortunately time. I wish we could go on for another hour on this. There's a lot of really, really important issues for us to discuss, but our time is over. I just want to really deeply thank our panelists and again, thank Professor Mann for putting this all together, and Jean Patricio for doing all the behind the scenes work, and everyone for coming. And if you're on the call, I see a couple questions in chat. I didn't have time to respond to them while I'm talking, so stick around for 1 minute. And I will respond to a couple specific questions, but we are going to bring this to a close. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.